So welcome to this session of the Minor Prophets. I'm Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, and I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. In this session, we're looking from chapter 2, verse 6 to chapter 4, verse 10. Just a bit of a recap on the last session. Zechariah is prophesying to exiles from Babylon back in the land, and spiritual conditions were pretty poor at that time, and Jehovah was sore displeased with your fathers, he said. He says, return to me, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will return to you, says Jehovah of hosts. So this is life during the times of the Gentiles. Remember that the times of the Gentiles is from the time of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem right down until the coming of Messiah, the Jewish king. Now, during this period of time, they rejected God's prophets, which led to the state that Israel are in at this particular time. The first vision we saw, God has a plan for Israel. The angel of Jehovah is in their midst, and there is promise of future blessing. We had that vision of horses. The three angelic beings went to and fro, but nothing was happening on the earth regarding moving God's plan for Israel. But then there'll be mercy for Zion, because the temple will be rebuilt and Jerusalem will be magnificent. The second vision, we had the four horns, and these are the horns that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. These were the four Gentile empires that had scattered Israel. And then we had the four smiths in this second vision. The four smiths, they were sent to punish the four horns. And those four smiths were the four kings. We had Cyrus, and then we had Alexander the Great, we had Pompey, and the final king will be Messiah himself. The third vision, Jerusalem will be the capital of the Messianic kingdom in the millennial earth. And we saw there was a man with a measuring line in his hand, and he was to measure, the land, and Jerusalem is said to be at that time to be built up, and she'll be the head of the world. She'll no longer be the, being wagged by the dog, but she'll be the head, and she'll be the one where all the nations will come to worship. Now we come into tonight's session, and we're looking at the explanation for the vision, the third vision, and we look at this in verses 6 to 13. Ho, ho, flee from the land of the north, says Jehovah. For I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heavens, says Jehovah. Ho, Zion, escape you that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, after glory hath he sent me unto the nations which plundered you. For he that touches you touches the apple of his eye. For behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall be a spoil to those that serve them. And you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for lo, I come, and I'll dwell in the midst of you, says Jehovah. And many nations shall join themselves to Jehovah in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of you. And you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me unto you. Verse 12, Jehovah shall inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and shall yet choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, before Jehovah, for he is waked up out of his holy habitation. So this third vision itself ended back in chapter 2, verse 5. So what we have in verses 6 to 13 is an explanation of the vision of the earlier verses. The explanation begins in verses 6 to 7 with a call to leave Babylon. It starts it by saying, ho, ho, flee from the land of the north. Now, ho translates a Hebrew word that elsewhere often means woe. And we find it in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 6 and 9, 12, 15, and 19. Habakkuk 2, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 19. Now, Zechariah is dealing with the land of the north. Now, from Israel's perspective, that would be Babylon. It's called the land of the north because invading armies and trading caravans from that land, from Babylon to Jerusalem, they came around the route called the Fertile Crescent and entered Palestine from the north. They come down through the Golan area. There'll be Jews in Babylon in the tribulation period, because Revelation 18 also makes that clear. Now, in that passage in Revelation 18, as well as here, there's a call for the Jews to leave Babylon. And he points out that I have spread you abroad as the four winds of heaven. So what that means is that it was God who scattered them, and part of that scattering was into Babylon. Now, historical Babylon did fall 2 years after this prophecy was given. But the final fulfillment of this prophecy will be in the last days, when God will regather them from their worldwide dispersion. But now the call is for them to leave Babylon. Ho Zion, escape you that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. And the use of the singular daughter here means the population of Babylon. So those Jews who didn't return were content to dwell or live amongst the Babylonians, because remember, they were there for 70 years. The point here is that in light of chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, that teaches that Israel is to be restored, the Jews of Babylon should return. Now, there's an immediate application here to the Jews still living in Babylon who had not yet returned. And that is that they need to get out, because the next smith, who would be Cyrus of the Medo-Persian horn, is coming. Remember, this is the period of the Babylonian Empire. And now, so Cyrus, the Medo-Persian Empire, is coming. And though what we see in this context here, the primary thrust of the text here is that in Babylon of the future, Jews are called upon to return, because God is about to make Jerusalem, instead of Babylon, the center of this earth. Because in the future days, Babylon will once again be the center of political power. In verses 8 to 9, he deals with the coming of the Messiah. Now, it's important here, first of all, to note who the speaker is, because of a point to be made in just a minute. He identifies himself as Jehovah. For thus says Jehovah of hosts. And then he says, after glory has he sent me unto the nations, or the Gentiles, which plundered you. So on account of God's glory, he sends the Messiah. And in keeping with the motif of the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where it says, I will curse them that curse you, the Messiah is sent to punish the nations for mistreating the Jews. So this must refer to the second coming, not the first, because Messiah came to seek and save the lost sheep of the house of Israel at the first coming, not to bring judgment. Judgment is at the second coming. And the reason that these Gentiles must be punished is because he that touches Israel touches the apple of his eye. So the apple of the eye, as the Israel motif here, comes out of Deuteronomy 32, verse 10. Deuteronomy 32, verse 10. The apple of the eye is the pupil of the eye. And in this case, it is God's eye. And if someone tries to touch the pupil of your eye, your first reaction to the pain is to slap the hand away. That's how God feels when a Gentile nation comes against Israel. It's as if they poked their finger into the pupil of God's eye, and God is going to use the Messiah in the future to slap them down. So the judgment is, I will shake my hand over them. So as he slaps them away, his hand will shake over them in judgment, and they shall be a spoil to those that serve them. So the ones that serve them here refers to the Jews who were forced to be servants of the Gentiles. Now, in the future, these nations are to become a spoil to Israel. At that point, he says, you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me. So when this comes to pass, they will know that it was God who had sent the Messiah. And we should notice that there are two different individuals named Jehovah in this passage. In verse 8, we noted that the speaker is Jehovah. Thus says Jehovah of hosts. But in verse 9, it is Jehovah who sends the speaker. Jehovah of hosts has sent me. So this is one of those Old Testament verses which shows a plurality in the Godhead. Jehovah is a speaker, yet Jehovah sends the speaker. Now the vision ends in verses 10 to 13 with God inhabiting Jerusalem. In verses 10 to 11, his point here is that Jehovah will dwell in Jerusalem. In verse 12, Israel is to rejoice because God will dwell in her midst. He says to the city, "Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion." Daughter of Zion, this is the nation of Israel. The reason is, for lo, I come. This is a reference to the second coming, because it is after the results of verses 8 and 9. And I will dwell in the midst of you, result of the second coming. The Messiah will physically, visibly, literally dwell in the midst of Jerusalem in Israel. And then in verse 11, he points out that many Gentiles will also come. Many nations shall join themselves to Jehovah in that day. Now, if you've been following through with the other studies we've been doing, that day is a shortened form of the day of the Lord. You know, during the tribulation, many Gentiles will also be saved. And they shall, it goes on to say here, they shall be my people. So as well as Israel, these saved Gentiles will also be God's people. Now, these are the same as the sheep Gentiles of Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. Matthew 25, 31 to 46, the sheep Gentiles. Now, in the second part of verse 11, points out that the Messiah dwelling in Israel's midst will be the evidence that God did send him. He says, I will dwell in the midst of you. Now here he's repeating the promise that he will live within Jerusalem. And that means you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me unto you. Here again, two Jehovahs are found in the passage, showing a sense of plurality within the Godhead. Now, if needed, just to show the plurality of the Godhead, verse 11. And many nations shall join themselves to Jehovah in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in the midst of you, and you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me unto you. In verse 12, he says that not only will he dwell in Jerusalem, but he will inherit Judah. So Jehovah shall inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land. And the Lord's portion is the people. Israel is God's inheritance. And again, as we said before, Deuteronomy 32, verse 9. Israel is God's inheritance, God's portion, and his portion will be found in the Holy Land in the Messianic kingdom. Now, notice here that it says the Holy Land. That's the title given to the land of Israel here. This is the only place in the whole of the Bible where it is called the Holy Land. Although this expression is frequently used to describe Israel, in the Hebrew Bible, it is usually referred to as Eretz Yisrael, E-R-E-T-Z, Y-Z-R-A-E-L, Eretz Yisrael. But only in this case, in this one case, is it called the Holy Land. He also points out that he will yet choose Jerusalem as a center. Now, in light of what God is going to do for the city of Jerusalem, there is a call to the earth for silence in verse 13. Be silent, all flesh, before Jehovah. And the reason is, for he hath waked up out of his holy habitation. In this final verse of this vision in verse 13, The picture depicts God as a lion who is about to come out of his place to fulfill the promises he made. Now we come to the fourth vision, and this is in chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. The point of this vision is that God will cleanse Israel so that the people can fulfill their original function by becoming a nation of priests. And we can summarize the vision in two main points. First, before the blessings of the first three visions can come to pass for Israel, the nation must undergo a spiritual transformation. The regeneration of Israel is the prerequisite for their final restoration. Second, this vision is for the purpose of restoring the people's confidence in the priesthood, which they may have lost because of the corruption which characterized it before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. Now in verses 1 to 5, we see a court case. And he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of Jehovah, and Satan standing at his right hand to be his adversary. And Jehovah said unto Satan, Jehovah rebuke you, O Satan. Yea, Jehovah that has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments as was standing before the angel. And he answered and spoke unto those that stood before him, saying, Take the filthy garments from off him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from you, and I will clothe you with rich apparel. And I said, this is Zechariah speaking, I said, Let them set a clean mitre upon his head. So they set a clean mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments. And the angel of Jehovah was standing by. Now, in these first 5 verses, we have a vision in which we look on in a court case, with verse 1 describing the situation. The verse begins with, and he showed me. He's pointing out here that this is now a new vision. And in this vision, Zechariah saw Joshua, the high priest, standing. So this is the same Joshua we find in the book of Haggai. He was the high priest. In this vision, he represents Israel. He's standing in for Israel as the defendant. He not only symbolizes Israel, but he also symbolizes the priesthood, because he was the high priest of that time. Remember, we had Joshua and Zerubbabel, and he was the high priest of that time, which we find in some of the other prophets. Ezra, for instance, says that, and so does Haggai. And Zechariah 6:11 to 13 will tell us that later on. So this is Joshua of that day representing Israel and the priesthood. Now we're told that he is standing in a court of law, ready to be judged one way or the other. If Joshua is condemned, so is Israel. But if he is declared innocent and is cleansed, then so is Israel, because he represents Israel. Now, besides Joshua, Zechariah sees Joshua before the angel of Jehovah in this vision. And he is serving as the judge. But as well as Joshua and Jehovah, we also see Satan standing at his right hand, who at this point had access to heaven, just as we saw just as we see in the book of Job. And his access here is to accuse Joshua, same as the book of Job. So here he's Joshua's adversary. He accuses the saints in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, and here in Zechariah 3:1. Here he uses his access to heaven for the purpose of accusing Israel before God. And in this vision, he's serving as the prosecuting attorney. In verse 2, we have the rebuking of Satan. And Jehovah said unto Satan, so the devil is addressed directly in this passage, and he receives a strong rebuke from God. Jehovah rebuke you, O Satan. Yea, Jehovah that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Now, In Hebrew, the rebuke carries through to the point of suppression and annihilation of the accusation. And the basis for the rebuke is God will yet choose Jerusalem. In other words, Satan is not rebuked because his accusations are not true. His accusations are probably true when made against Israel. Nor is Satan rebuked because Israel is righteous. Israel is not a righteous nation at this time. The reason Satan is rebuked is because of God's choice, because of his unchanging love and his choice of the Jews as his chosen people. God intends to save Israel, as we see from his question. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? A brand is a piece of wood that has been thrown into the fire, but before it's completely burned up, it's plucked out of the fire. It is burning, but it is grabbed out of the fire because there's still a use for it. And the Lord rescued this man as someone snatches a stick from the fire. Now, this is a symbol which is used again in Amos chapter 4, verse 11. So because God intends to save Israel and choose Israel, Satan's accusations are now rebuked. Then in verse 3, we're given the description of the state of Joshua. Now, Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and those filthy garments describe Israel's state at that time, showing that Satan's accusations were actually true. In English, they're called filthy garments, but the Hebrew is much stronger. It refers to filth of the most loathsome character, of the kind described in Isaiah 64:6, which means that there's human excrement on them. So not only was he dirty looking, but he smelled bad. And this would have rendered him ceremonially unclean. This is Joshua the high priest. Again, he points out here that Joshua was standing before the angel. He was standing in a court of law, but he's not going to be condemned. In fact, he was declared innocent, not because he was actually innocent, but because the Messiah would take the guilt upon himself. So in verse 4, we have the changing of his garments. The judge gave an order. He answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, so the command is now given to the other angels to take the filthy garments from off him. And the removal of filthy garments symbolizes the forgiveness of sins here, as it does in Isaiah 61 verse 10. Isaiah 61 verse 10, where it says he's clothed with the garments of salvation. So the judge's order is to remove Joshua's filthy garments. And then we get the judge's verdict. Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from you. So clearly then Joshua and Israel, whom he represents, definitely had iniquity, but God causes it to pass away. Then he says, I will clothe you with rich apparel. So in place of the filthy garments which represent Israel's sins, he will now be clothed in the garments of salvation. Now at this point, Zechariah speaks up and says, let them set a clean mitre upon his head. Now the mitre was the priestly hat, and on the front of it was a little golden plate which had written on it in Hebrew, holiness unto Jehovah. And that was pointing out that as far as God is concerned, and in spite of the sins of the priesthood previously, those sins had been cleansed, and the people should have their confidence restored in the priesthood once again. What God will do for the priesthood, he will someday do for all Israel. Now, in response to all of this, they set a clean mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments. And these are clean garments. And in this vision, there are probably the actual priestly robes themselves. Verse 5 ends, and the angel of Jehovah was standing by, showing that he was approving these actions of putting on the clean mitre as Zechariah had suggested. The Messiah or the angel of Jehovah, the angel of Jehovah is the second person of the triunity, Messiah, was authenticating and approving the priesthood. Now, in verses 1 to 5, we have the court case. Now, in verses 6 to 10, we hear the message to Joshua, the high priest. And the angel of Jehovah protested unto Joshua, saying, "Thus says Jehovah of hosts, if you will walk in my ways, and if you will keep my charge, then you also shall judge my house and shall keep my courts. And I will give you a place of access among these that stand by. Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your fellows that sit before you, for they are men that are a sign. For behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch. For behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, upon one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave the graving thereof, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. In that day, says Jehovah of hosts, shall you invite every man his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree." In this second part of Zechariah's 4th vision, we have a personal message now to Joshua. In verse 6, it's strongly stated here, "And the angel of Jehovah protested unto Joshua." The Hebrew word for protested means that what he had to say was emphatically stated. First part of verse 7, Joshua's duties are twofold. First, walk in my ways. This refers to his personal spiritual walk. And second, keep my charge. This has to do with his official duties. If he will do this, God spells out the reward he'll have. And this reward includes 3 things. First, you shall judge my house. Now, God's house is a temple. So this means that Joshua would be given various temple duties, and that would include determining what is kosher and what is non-kosher, what is clean and what is not clean. Second, you will keep my courts. This means he would have control over who would be allowed to enter and who would be kept out of the temple compound. And third, I will give you a place of access among these that stand by. Now, these that stand by are the angels. And so he would have free access to the angelic courts, which was mentioned back in chapter 3, verse 4. Those that stood by, that's the angels. Now, having said what Joshua's duties are and what his rewards will be if he fulfills them, in verse 8, God declares that the priests are a sign. Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your fellows that sit before you. So the high priest and the common priest who served him are being spoken to here. For they, that's the priesthood, are a sign. The specific point of this sign is that God will bring forth my servant, the branch. Now, in the Old Testament, we have the development of the branch doctrine because others besides Zechariah does this. And we have a bit of a summary of this doctrine before we continue on here. There are 4 things concerning the branch. First of all, the branch is a servant. And this is his point here in chapter 3, verse 8. That happens to be the theme of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus, the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah. And second, the branch is a man. Later on in chapter 6, verse 12, Zechariah will again discuss the Messiah as the branch, but in that passage, the branch is a man. And that is the theme of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus, the Messiah, Son of Man. And that emphasizes the humanity of Jesus. And then third, we see that the branch is a king. And this is brought out by Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, Jeremiah 23, verse 5, and also 33, verse 15. Now, this happens to be Matthew's theme, Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And then fourthly, we have the branch is God. And this is brought out in Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, Isaiah 4, verse 2, also Jeremiah 23, verses 5 to 6, and Jeremiah 33, 15 to 16. Now, this is John's theme. The Gospel of John, the theme is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And John emphasizes the deity of the Messiah. So we have these four facets of the branch doctrine in the Old Testament, and each gospel writer develops one of those four facets. Here in Zechariah 3, verse 9, we also learn that the branch is a stone. Behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua. Now, whenever the word stone is used symbolically, it is always a symbol for the Messiah. And three examples from many would be Isaiah 28:16, where we see a foundation stone. Psalm 118, verse 22, which is a stone that the builders rejected. And Daniel chapter 2, verse 35, it's the stone that smote the image on the feet. And then he goes on to say here, upon one stone are 7 eyes. So God is pointing out here that there are not many stones. There's only one stone that represents the Messiah. And this one stone has 7 eyes, which emphasizes that he is the all-seeing Messiah, having the divine characteristics of omniscience and omnipresence. And we find it in Revelation chapter 5, verse 6, Revelation 5:6. Then he says, I will engrave the graving thereof. The point here is that the identification of the name of Messiah will be made on the stone. Then I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. Now, he's referring to that land, that's a specific land, which is the Holy Land, which we saw before back in chapter 2, verse 12. This deals with the fact of the national regeneration of Israel that will occur in just one day when they believe in the Messiah, just prior to his second coming. This point is also made in Isaiah 66, verse 8. Isaiah 66, verse 8. Finally, the vision now ends in verse 10 with the millennium, from which he gives us a summary scene. In that day, says Jehovah of hosts, shall you invite every man his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree. This motif of sitting under a vine and under a fig tree is used as a symbol of security and prosperity, especially in the millennial kingdom. It's used that way in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 25, and Isaiah 36:16, and Micah 4, verse 4. Now we come to the fifth vision in chapter 4, verses 1 to 14. The main point of the fifth vision is that through the work of the Holy Spirit, Israel will become a witness to the world. We'll begin with some bit of a summary here. We see 3 points here. First of all, the vision, this vision, we're looking at the fifth vision, contains a personal message to Zerubbabel, who was the civil leader in Israel in Zechariah's day. Now, Zerubbabel had been frustrated over the building of the temple. The foundations had been laid in Ezra chapter 3, verse 8, Ezra 3:8. But because of legal opposition, the building program was forcibly stopped in Ezra chapter 4, verses 23 to 24. Ezra 4, 23 to 24. And that was because of initially of foreign enemy opposition. However, 15 years have now passed and the original opposition is no longer there. Now Zerubbabel is frustrated by the apathy of the people, which can be seen in Haggai chapter 1. So this personal message to Zerubbabel is to encourage him in his spirit concerning the completion of the temple, because the problem is not with him, but it's with the Jewish people. Second, this vision deals with the restoration of the Jewish state after it is filled with the Holy Spirit. And third, it will deal with what this author calls the third sign of Jonah. The third sign of Jonah, which is the third sign of resurrection to which Israel will respond. That then is the background to the fifth vision in verses 1 to 14. The vision itself comes out in verses 1 to 3. The angel that talked with me came again and waked me as a man that is wakened out of his sleep. And he said unto me, what see you? And I said, I have seen, and behold, a candlestick all of gold with its bowl upon the top of it, and its 7 lamps thereon. There are 7 pipes to each of the lamps which are upon the top thereof, and 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right side of the bowl, and the other upon the left side thereof. So the vision itself begins in verse 1 with the preparation of Zechariah. The angel that talked with me came again. So now he's introducing this new vision. And waked me as a man that is wakened out of his sleep. Why did he wake him? Well, in order to prepare him to receive this vision. The vision itself we find in verses 2 to 3. Zechariah was awake when he received these visions. By now, he has already had 4 tremendous visions. He had fallen into a state of exhaustion. Similar to, remember, Daniel slept after his great visions in Daniel chapter 8, verse 18, Daniel 8:18 and Daniel 10:8 and 9. Now the angel has to wake him up because he's not to be given this vision in a dream. He's going to see every bit of this vision. And in verse 2, he sees a lampstand. The question here is raised. And he said unto me, what see you? And the answer is, behold, a candlestick. Now, this was not really a candlestick because there were no candles back then. It was a lampstand which burned oil. So it burned oil, it burned olive oil. It wasn't tallow. It was made of gold with 7 lamps. Now, to understand this vision, we need to know that the lampstand was used as a symbol for Israel, who was to be a light to the Gentiles. And you can have a look at Isaiah 62, verses 1 to 2. And what this vision shows is that Israel will serve as a lamp, as a light in the kingdom. It was also a symbol of the Messiah as a light to the Gentiles in Isaiah 42, verse 6, Isaiah 42:6, and Isaiah 49:6. So the 7-branched menorah, the lampstand, has its own history. It first appears in the tabernacle. It then stood in the first temple. Later, it stood in the second temple, which was then in the process of being built. And this became the focus of the Feast of Hanukkah. But then an 8-branched lamp was used instead of the 7-branched one. That's only used at Hanukkah. Now, according to Jewish writings, in the year AD 30, the year of Christ's death, the middle lamp of the 24-hour lamp mysteriously ceased burning. You might recall, or you might not know, but this 7-branched lamp was kept lit at all times. It was always had light. So what we see is that the middle lamp of the 24-hour lamp mysteriously stopped burning. And in the diaspora, in the dispersion, it became a symbol of Judaism. That's the lampstand. And today it's in the coat of arms of the state of Israel. It was all of gold because it was made of pure gold. It had its bowl upon the top of it. So above this 7-branched lampstand was a bowl. And then he points out that it had 7 lamps thereon. So it's a lampstand with 7 lamps fixed to it. And we're going to see later what this is talking about. Now, then he noticed that there were 7 pipes leading to each of the lamps. So rather than just 1 pipe to each lamp, there were 7 pipes, 1 to each individual lamp, which was upon the top. So this made a total of 49 ducts, D-U-C-T-S, or smaller pipes, which were feeding oil from the bowl above to the 7 lamps underneath. We're going to see an image of this shortly. Now, since a large part of Zechariah is based upon Daniel's prophecies, these 49 ducts or pipes represent the first set of 7 sevens, and that's from the set of 77s of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. That's Daniel 9, 24 to 27. And most specifically, his verse 25. They represent the 49-year period during which Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. The bowl of oil sitting above the lampstand supplies the oil to it through these 49 ducts or pipes. So that's through those 49 years. Now in verse 3, Zechariah sees 2 olive trees. He says 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right side of the bowl, the other upon the left side thereof. So on each side of this bowl, above the lampstand, there were 2 olive trees, one on either side. Now these 2 olive trees are supplying the bowl with oil directly. So they represent an inexhaustible supply of oil. And whereas in the tabernacle and the temple, the supply of oil was dependent upon what was given by the people, in this vision, it is coming directly from the source, the olive trees. Now, the main ingredient that is being emphasized throughout this vision is the oil. It comes from the olive oil trees via 2 spouts and empties into the bowl. And from the bowl, down the 49 ducts or 49 pipes, it feeds oil to the 7 lamps. So this oil is a symbol, olive oil or oil, sorry, is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And we're going to see this in verse 6. So what Zechariah sees is a lampstand representing Israel filled with oil. It's a picture of Israel as a saved nation, fulfilling their calling in the Messianic kingdom to be the light of the Gentiles. Now, that's the 7-branched menorah. And then we see the 2 olive trees, we see the bowl above it, and then the ducts feeding, or the 2 pipes feeding into the bowl. And then we have these, we'll get there, we have these 49 smaller pipes going into the actual lampstand. This is demonstrating Israel as a saved nation, fulfilling their calling in the Messianic kingdom, which is to be a light to the Gentile world. We see the purpose in verses 4 to 10. And I answered and spoke to the angel that talked with me, saying, what are these, my Lord? And the angel that talked with me answered and said unto me, know you not what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, this is the word of Jehovah unto Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says Jehovah of hosts. Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forth the top stone with shoutings of grace, grace unto it. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, his hands shall also finish it. And you shall know that Jehovah of hosts has sent me unto you. For who has despised the day of small things? For these 7 shall rejoice and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of Jehovah, which run to and fro through the whole earth. So, in these 6 verses, we're given the purpose of this vision, which is to serve as an encouragement to Zerubbabel. Like his contemporary Haggai, Zechariah ministered to both Israel's leaders, Joshua, the high priest, and Zerubbabel, the civil leader. In verse 4, we have Zechariah's request for the interpretation. I answered, saying, what are these? So his question is not about the meaning of the menorah. They'll come later. But in any case, he already knows from previous revelation that the lampstand represents Israel. What he's asking about is the purpose of the whole vision. The word these is plural and indicates he's including all the details of the whole vision. In verse 5, we have the response of the angel. He answered and said unto me, know you not what these are? In other words, don't you know what this vision is about? And Zechariah's response is, no, my Lord. He didn't know the purpose of it just yet, but he's about to find out. He's going to be given two basic messages for Zerubbabel. The first is in verses 6 to 7. In verse 6, the angel points out the means whereby God will accomplish his program. Then he spoke, saying, this is the word of Jehovah unto Zerubbabel, saying. So clearly, this is a message to Zerubbabel, to show him the means by which God will achieve his purposes. First, not by might. That is, not by physical power. Second, nor by power, meaning not by mental power. Third, but by my spirit. God's work will be accomplished by spiritual power through the working of the Holy Spirit himself. Now we notice that oil is in abundant supply throughout every part of the vision, and oil is a biblical symbol of the Holy Spirit. And the lamps are supplied not by human hands, but by divine providence. So the point is, this temple will be completed by divine power because there is an inexhaustible supply of this power, since its source is the eternal living Holy Spirit. The establishment of Israel will be by the same means. Often, modern Israelis boast we did it, but God's answer is not by physical or mental power, but by my spirit, says Jehovah. It is God who did it. In verse 7, God makes Zerubbabel a promise, saying that the mountain will become a plain. It's framed here in a question. Who art you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you shall become a plain. Now, whenever the word mountain is used symbolically in scripture, it is always a symbol for a king, a kingdom, or a throne. And the point is that the king who put a stop to the rebuilding of the temple will be removed, as every impediment to God's program will be removed. The king who was responsible for hindering the reconstruction work was the Emperor Cambyses II, who committed suicide near Mount Carmel, setting the stage for the new emperor, Darius IV, Hystaspes, to give the Jews permission to continue rebuilding the walls. So the first promise is that this mountain will become a plain. It would no longer be a problem. The second promise made to Zerubbabel is, he shall bring forth the top stone. Now, when a foundation stone is laid, that marks the beginning of the construction. That had been laid 15 years earlier. Putting the top stone in place marks the completion. So his point here is that just as Zerubbabel was the man who laid the foundation stone, so God would make sure that he also laid the top stone. Now, according to Ezra chapter 3, verse 8, Zerubbabel did start the reconstruction of the temple, and indeed Zerubbabel did finish it in Ezra 6, verses 14 to 15. Third, he says this will be done with shoutings of grace, grace unto it. Grace means unmerited favor. So he affirms that God will do it and reaffirms it, authenticating what he said in verse 6, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. In verses 8 to 10, he gives a second message to Zerubbabel. Verse 8 is the introduction to it. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, and in verse 9 is the promise. Zerubbabel, who laid the foundation, will also finish it, as confirmed in Ezra 6:14 to 15. The point is, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, this temple, so his hands will also finish it. And then he shows that the fulfillment of this prophecy will authenticate the prophetic office of Zechariah. You shall know that Jehovah's host has sent me unto you. Now, anyone can go around claiming to be a prophet, receiving direct revelation from God. So a real prophet had to authenticate himself by giving genuine near prophecies in order that his distant prophecies could also be trusted. So here is one of those near prophecies. Zerubbabel will complete the temple, and he did, as recorded in Ezra 6:14 to 15. That means then that all of Zechariah's distant prophecies could now be trusted. In verse 10, a promise is made to the people. For who has despised the day of small things? Now, the foundations of this reconstructed temple had not been much to look at. And this was brought out in Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 to 13, and Haggai chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. Now he says that God has a more glorious purpose, but this is just a starting point. So do not despise it as being insignificant. Now, as it turned out, Zerubbabel's temple was insignificant when compared with Solomon's temple, but later it was remodeled by Herod the Great and became the Herodian temple. And this was even more magnificent than the Solomonic temple. Even rabbis who did not like Herod did say that whoever had not seen the temple he built had not seen beauty in all his life. So this is a temple that Messiah himself would come to, as Malachi chapter 3, verse 1 will prophesy. The final point is that Israel will yet be glorified and become a light to the Gentiles, as in Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 2. Isaiah 60, 1 to 2. But Zechariah 4 is just the starting point. Then he states, for these seven shall rejoice and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel. The 7 lamps of the 7-branch lampstand will rejoice when they see Zerubbabel pick up the hammer, because this will signal fresh movement towards completing the temple. But then he explains what these 7 lamps represent. For these are the 7 eyes of Jehovah. They represent the eyes of Jehovah. Since the number 7 expresses the idea of completion, this emphasizes that Jehovah is the all-seeing God, as Zechariah 3 verse 9 pointed out. These eyes run to and fro throughout the earth. They are alert and watchful throughout the whole earth to make sure that God's purposes are fulfilled. Notice that this is done according to the to and fro motif, indicating that angelic beings are actually the agents. So it means that God himself will rejoice when Zerubbabel picks up the tools to complete the temple. And while this temple had only humble beginnings, God was happy with it. Therefore, do not despise the day of small things. And that's where we'll leave it in this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.